So, with this finally being summertime, it's nice because you know what's coming in 6 months? Snow, yeah. And so right now, with us being summertime, for the King family, we are currently in baseball season with our oldest son, Jackson. And if you don't know Jackson, he just finished kindergarten. He's 6 years old, and he really is an amazing kid. I love the kid to death. But to be honest, at times, he thinks he has already arrived as a baseball player. So much so that before the season, I had some time off, and, in the spring, and I was like, hey, let's go hit some balls, just practice. He was like, oh, I don't need to practice, Dad. I'm already good enough. And so also, again, I was just watching a baseball game. I'm a Yankees fan, so I was watching a Yankees game, and, I was trying to teach him just a little bit about the game and why they were doing what they were doing, and teaching him about the players. He says, Dad, I know all the rules of baseball. I play baseball, so, you don't have to teach me that. Ooh. I'm quite sure he's very confident. And I believe that he thinks that he can go into a major league batter's box right now and get a hit off of a major league pitcher. When in reality, he would be in the fetal position the first time he saw a 90-mile-an-hour fastball go past his face. And so you gotta love the confidence of the kid. At times I wish I had some of that confidence. But as a parent, I am trying to find the balance for Jackson. Whether, between being confident in himself and then also recognizing the arrogance and the thinking that he's awesome, he doesn't need any help. And so I know that if he continues down this path and if he continues this way, it's going to lead him making a lot of decisions that he's going to end up regretting. And as a parent, there is very little I care about more than helping my kids live without regret. And so I know that we all have made decisions that we've regretted. Maybe, and if we look back on, we wish we would have made them differently. And the question now is, how do I make decisions that I make moving forward that I'm not going to regret later? And one of my favorite movies of all time, it's a movie called Inception. And there's always been this quote of dialogue that's always stuck with me. And there's this man, his name's Sato. He's this rich and powerful man. And he's trying to convince the main character of the movie, his name's Cobb, he's trying to convince him to do this job for him, this impossible task. And if he can complete it, he will wipe his criminal record clean so he can go back home to America and that he can see his kids again. And Cobb is worried. He's thinking, even if he can get this impossible job done, can this guy who he barely knows, deliver this promise that seems impossible? And so the quote is by Sato. He says to the main character, Cobb, he says, don't you want to take a leap of faith or become an old man filled with regret, waiting to die alone? And so what I love about this quote is that it's always kind of made me reflect that at the end of my life, I do not want to look back at the decisions that I have made and just have this regret about what I did or I did not do, and just kind of question all of the decisions that I've made. I would love to get to a place where I'm at peace with my decisions and confidence that the decisions that I'm making now, that I'm not going to regret later on. Now, wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be great to be at a place where you have total confidence in the decisions that you're making, that they're not decisions that 5-10 years down the road we regret? So, now, I think that there's a way that we can get to that place in our lives. A place that we can get that confidence in our decisions and not be at a place where at the end of our lives we're an old man or old woman filled with regret because of the decisions that we have or haven't made in our lives. And what's kind of weird as I was putting this message together is that the path to this, it comes from a pretty simple biblical principle that I feel that we're all familiar with. But it's a principle that I don't think that many of us kind of connect together with making wise decisions and avoiding regret. So let's just take a look at the Bible, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. And so we're going to start off at the very beginning of Jesus' life, literally at the moment of his birth. And we're going to be taking a look at Luke chapter 2. And you may know the story, but if you don't, take note of exactly where he's born. So in Luke chapter 2, it says, "Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." So we see the very first time that we're introduced to Jesus, it says that he was in a manger, which is not a snuggly bed. It's actually a feeding trough for animals, for farm animals. Probably which had hay in it, which is crazy itchy, so I don't know if I would want to lay a baby down in that, but, it all sounds nice and sanitary, right? Now, remember, Jesus, he's supposed to be the Messiah. This is not some palace. It's not somewhere where you would expect a king to be born. And I know that there are Christmas carols that make it sound like things were so peaceful and nice and cuddly, but in reality, Jesus, he was born in a barn, and you can't get much more low-born than that. And so I want you to keep that image in your mind as we take a look at the next example from Jesus' life. And where I'm going to be speaking from is that Jesus and his disciples, they had just came into Jerusalem for a festival the Jewish people celebrate every year. And that's the festival of Passover. And in the middle of the Passover meal, Jesus did something completely unexpected. So let's pick up with the story in John chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. "So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him." Okay, so just to give a little bit of context of Jesus, he is 3 years into his ministry. He has preached to the masses. He has, garnered a following. He has disciples of his own. And for the disciples, they believe that Jesus, he was the Son of God. And here we see he is doing something that was reserved for servants. Leaders and teachers, they did not do this because it's stinky and it's a gross job. Who wants to touch other guys' gross feet? Back in the day, all they wore was sandals, and they walked everywhere, and there was sand and dirt, and it was not a job people were signing up for. So the job of washing someone else's feet, would that be of a servant? And so the fact that this task is being done by their leader, their teacher, their rabbi, this is a big deal to see Jesus down on his hands and feet, washing the feet of men that served alongside him. So I want to remind you, the first picture we see of Jesus, he was born in a barn and placed in a feeding trough reserved for barn animals. The second picture that we are looking at is Jesus doing a nasty job. It's reserved for lowly servants. It's something that no one would volunteer to do. And lastly, I want to take a look at a third picture. And we're only going to jump about 24 hours from where we just saw Jesus washing his disciples' feet. But in that 24 hours, a lot has changed. Jesus has been betrayed by Judas. we see that who also Judas was in the room when Jesus was washing their feet. He was arrested. He was put on trial. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death, beaten to within an inch of his life, and he was crucified on a Roman cross. So we're going to pick up the story here in Matthew 27, starting in verse 38, where it says, 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his left, one on his right. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross, if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. So, we see Jesus here at the cross in one of his last moments. And the cross, it was a Roman type execution where they put criminals to death. And it has to be up there as one of the most unimaginable, the worst imaginable ways you could ever die. Like, not to mention the fact that they beat Jesus within an inch of his life. They made him carry his own cross through the town to the place that they would eventually crucify him. And back in the Roman times, like, there wasn't even a word to describe the type of pain from a crucifixion, so much so that the Romans, they invented a word for it. And in Latin, the word excruciare means as painful as a crucifixion or from the cross. And that is today where our own English word of excruciating, that derives from. And so when we say that something is excruciating, that means it's like the worst type of pain imaginable. And so at this point, Jesus, he was betrayed by Judas, his disciple. He was denied by Peter. He was beaten and nailed to a cross where he would die a slow and painful death of asphyxiation, just hanging up there. And while all this was happening, he was being mocked by the crowds, by the chief priests, the guards, and even the criminals that were next to him. It says that they were both hurling insults at him. And they were mocking him, saying, if you're the Son of God, like, save yourself. Like, then I can't imagine just a more horrifying situation to go through than what he did on that day. So now we have 3 pictures that I wanted to show you. One, from his birth. Second, from his ministry. And one from his death. And in all pictures, we see Jesus in very humble circumstances. He was born in a barn and placed in a feeding trough. He washed the feet of his followers, including the one who had already sold him out to Roman authorities. He allowed himself to be beaten, to be mocked, and insulted as he was being crucified between 2 criminals. So you could say, like, why would Jesus do this? If truly Jesus was the Son of God, like, why would he choose to allow all of these kinds of things to happen? Well, fortunately, we don't have to look too much further, because actually at the end of the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet, he explains to them exactly what he did and why he did it. So let's take a look back at that story in John chapter 13, where in verse 14 it says, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. So we see here that Jesus, he identifies that what he did, it was from a place of humility. And we see that in Jesus' birth, like he did not have pomp and circumstance surrounding his birth. Like he was born in a lowly barn. Like it was humble. We see in his ministry that he did not come to be served, but to serve others. Like he got down on his hands and knees and showed them what it meant to be a real servant leader by showing his disciples that we have to humble ourselves, to that even of a lowly servant. He showed that it's not about what others can do for you, but what can you do to help others, and thinking of others before our own self. And lastly, in his death, like he died a criminal's death. Even when he committed absolutely no crime, he still did the will of the Father. And even if it meant dying a horrible death while others were mocking and cursing him, and in the midst of all of that, like he was humble. He did not come back at them with vengeance or anger, but with love and with grace. You see, those criminals that were next to him, Jesus even ministered to them while he was on the cross. And in other scriptures, you can look and see that by the end, he says to one of them, it said that the other was still cursing him, but the other one, he said to him, "Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." And so we see that the difference between Jesus and the criminals, like, they deserved to die, like, while Jesus didn't. And even though Jesus was suffering the same Roman penalty and the same physical pain as the criminals, like he is the sinless one who doesn't deserve this. And I honestly cannot find a more humble act and selfless act than what he showed on that day. So remember, I told you that there is a character trait that we're all familiar with and may not be the first thing that we think of when it comes to making wise decisions. And obviously this character trait today that we're talking about is humility. Like Jesus lived humbly. And maybe right now, like it doesn't make sense to you. Like what does this have to do with making good choices and living without regret? But Jesus, being an incredible teacher, and he had a vast knowledge of the scriptures. And so Jesus, he would have known that in Proverbs chapter 11, verse 2, it says that when pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with humility comes wisdom. I want to read that again because it is so important. And that is when pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with humility comes wisdom. So I want to emphasize Jesus. He is a rabbi. He is a teacher. He is the Son of God. He would have known this passage. He would have understood what that pride is connected with disgrace. And that humility is connected to wisdom. And Jesus would have understood that, like with living confidence and living without regret, it's not about our own wisdom, but rather about humility. And I think that if Jesus were here today and we asked him, like, how do we live this life without regret? Like, I think he would tell us, when we cultivate humility, God grows wisdom. When we cultivate humility, God grows wisdom. So now, maybe you've always known that humility and wisdom are kind of connected, but I've kind of never kind of connect them before. But if you take a look, take a moment to think about it, like it makes sense. If I'm arrogant or prideful, like I'm not going to listen or learn, no matter whoever might be teaching me or have something to teach me. Like you have that feeling like I'm just going to do things my own way, in my own understanding, and probably in isolation. But if I'm humble, like we should be able to recognize that we have so much to learn, whether it's from other people around us or whether it's from the scriptures. We should be thinking, like, rather than doing things my own way, like I'll listen to the wisdom of others around me or the scriptures. And maybe there's people that have gone before and experienced things, and that'll help me navigate whatever it is that we're facing. And so this is the exact same reason why I worry about my son Jackson. And like I said, we're Yankees fans in the King household. And so if the manager of the Yankees came into our house today and tried to teach Jackson something about his swing, I would probably assume my son, he would tell him, oh, I already know how to swing the bat. I had a couple hits yesterday in my game. I don't think you have a whole lot to teach me. Now, obviously, Aaron Boone being a former player and, has like over 150 home runs in the major leagues, he's better at it than Jackson. But if Jackson thinks that he's better, then there's no reason for him to listen. And this is the exact reason, the exact problem with pride. And this is why it's such an important part of wisdom. So for us, like, how do we live with less regret? By making wiser choices. Well, we have to cultivate humility in our lives so that when we do, that God grows that wisdom inside of us and that we cannot grow ourselves. And I think that's the problem. We are terrible at cultivating humility. And we have been since the very beginning in the Garden of Eden. Since the very beginning of humanity. Like, living a humble life is not an easy thing. To put others before ourselves, like being selfless. So, if we're so bad at it, all right, the question is, how do we do it? Well, I'm going to go back to the best person to show us, and that's Jesus. And in Matthew 23, Jesus, he is talking to his disciples. And the disciples, they just asked him, who was the greatest disciple? And Jesus' answer, he helps us understand how to be humble. And so in verses 11 and 12, Jesus says, the greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So, here we see Jesus. He's saying that whoever the greatest servant or the greatest disciple who it's going to be, it's not going to be the leader, but the servant. So, he's saying whenever you exalt yourself, he's saying, you will be humbled. Humbled as you're going to be brought down a peg or two. Because of the way that you think of yourself. We are not as good as we think we are. And he also said that those who are humble will one day be exalted by God. So, when you live humbly, you do not do things for credit or for admiration of people. And a lot of the examples that Jesus gives, he's flat out just telling his disciples or telling the people, don't be like the Pharisees or the church leaders or the government leaders. And he even says that in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, for he says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And previous to this verse, his other disciples, James and John, they were asking, can one of them to be on the left hand and the other be on the right hand in Jesus' glory? And so we see that Jesus say, that doesn't matter. He's saying, I came on this earth not to be served, but to serve others. Like, he then further explains to the disciples that, a lot of people in government positions or other people, like, that they lord their authority other people. And he's saying, like, that is not how things are going to work. And that if anybody wants to become great, that they would have to be a servant. And whoever wants to be first must put themselves last. Once again, you have to lower your position. So we have Jesus' words, we have his actions, and if we look at it all together, it's obvious that the way we cultivate humility is by purposely choosing to position ourselves lower than others around us, to serve them. Just as Jesus was that example, he is our prime example of what it looks like to serve others. And we have to realize that we are not here to be served by others. And so what we learn from Jesus is that we cultivate humility by serving for God's glory. We cultivate humility by serving. And we don't serve ourselves. We serve God first, doing whatever he asks, whenever he asks. We do it for his glory, and then we serve others. We can take any opportunity that we have to make a difference in someone's life, and not so that we can feel better about ourselves, but we do it for God's glory, that his name will be made famous. And those words are, I'm just going to say it's simple. But the reality is, it is so challenging. It's challenging because our default is to position ourselves higher than others, like not to think about others first. But Jesus says that's not how things are going to work. He says, take the lowest place. Remember, the barn, washing feet, paying the price of death for a crime that he was innocent of, so that we could have our sins taken away when we are the ones who have sinned and we are the ones that deserve that penalty, but Jesus took that for us. And so we have to break from that mindset that we are what's most important. We should be thinking, is there something that I can do for someone to show them the love of God? Am I using my God-given abilities or talents to serve others, whether it's leading a small group or hanging out with kids at church, taking someone a meal, providing a need that you just see needs to be met and just doing it? Whether it's, just talking to somebody that maybe needs someone to listen to them, and just doing these things with the mindset that probably no one's going to know about it, and not to expect anything else in return. And this is exactly what I want my son Jackson to get before it's too late. As his dad, I want to be able to have him to learn to cultivate humility. Cultivate humility so that God will grow wisdom in him, that helps him live a life down the road that he's not going to regret. I want him to understand that when pride comes, then comes disgrace. I want him to understand that with humility comes wisdom. Nothing good happens when pride is in the picture, and I don't want him to continue thinking that he's the best at everything, or he doesn't need to work or improve at things because he thinks he's already a finished product. And if he does continue that, he will go down a path of prideful actions and decisions that ultimately he will regret. And so my hope for all of us is that we would be able to see God's wisdom grow in us as we cultivate that humility. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen overnight. But imagine how much more joy that you have in your life if you knew that you weren't going to live with regret. I cannot think of a better way to guarantee than to know that God's wisdom is growing inside me. So I just want to finish off with just saying this. We need to live like Jesus. Live like him in the fact that we serve God first. We serve others second. And we need to position ourselves as a servant to those around you, not out of obligation or where you feel like you have to, but out of confidence, knowing that by cultivating this humility, it makes room for God to grow his wisdom in us. And that when we are making choices and decisions out of God's wisdom and not our own, there's absolutely no reason that we would ever regret. Let's finish in prayer this morning.